Hello everybody and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here and I'm joined by Don as usual. Today we have returning guest Khalid and we are going to be talking about the occult, esotericism, traditionalism, all that kind of fun stuff. Yeah, so maybe we should start off here defining our terms, something like that. Like, what is esotericism? What is the occult? Like, that term, I think a lot of people are sort of familiar with it, but what are we going to be talking about exactly? Like, what is this thing? Like,
the occult is probably the most interesting of those terms to me because it pivots on the connotation of hiddenness. And occultism obviously encompasses like many different things, like many different ideas, but at its core, I feel like, you know, in terms of what it denotes the idea that there's some sort of hidden structure or meaning behind events. It kind of creates a certain dualism between exoteric and esoteric, where there's an external aspect to practice, behavior, society, and then there's a hidden aspect. And that's esoteric and hidden can kind of go hand in hand. When things are inside, they're sort of presumed to be hidden. And that's the idea that there's sort of hidden. And, you know, of course, I think maybe I've mentioned this in the podcast before, but it's definitely one of the recurring tropes of esotericism or occultism, that it's sort of privileged information or privileged knowledge that only certain elite people have access to. And that, you know, is really the most basic definition that one can provide of what the occult is. And of course, you know, this is tied in many ways to sort of traditionalism. A lot of times sort of the idea of lost knowledge within one culture or within all cultures that, you know, maybe people are trying to bring back through kind of a vanguard of people with special knowledge or special access to that information.
Right. And when you're talking about traditionalism, we're talking about capital T traditionalism.
Yes.
A very particular spiritual movement, I guess you could call it, something along those lines.
Yeah. That would basically be like, you know, what René Guénon and like Evola were very influential in sort of shaping. And yeah, the basic idea is that, you know, the certain traditional structures of life, usually, you know, some kind of hidden knowledge, access to like a supernal or subliminal world had been sort of cut off by sort of social factors, which might even themselves be kind of an exoteric veil for sinister occult forces. And, you know, it had cut off that connection and it needed to be restored. That's the idea behind, you know, as you say, capital T traditionalism, not just the idea of, you know, certain practices being tried and true, you know, lowercase c traditionalism, but, you know, sort of a movement originating in the 19th century, early 20th century, with that goal in mind, sort of that often look to, you know, before we started recording, Don, you know, mentioned theosophy. A lot of these movements would look to, you know, the East kind of with an Orientalist eye, trying to reclaim that sort of primordial knowledge that the West had been cut off from.
Mm-hmm. Is it, do you think, correct to think of this as something that this whole thing, the occult and all that, is something that started in the 19th century? Because there's, you know, it sort of, it gets a little muddy because it's always referencing these past things and it's trying to like draw a lineage to the past and all that. But it's kind of difficult to gauge how much of that is like authentic and real and how much of that is like a mythology that they created.
Well, yeah, it's a complex question because, like, when we speak in English, we use certain terms. Like, obviously, you know, the idea of the occult, like, that can be traced back, you know, obviously there's, like, medieval Latin texts that will reference, like, the occult, or will use these similar terms, like, of eso and aso, the Islamic tradition. Obviously, the idea of zahir and batin, you know, is a big thing. So these concepts of inside, outside, apparent and hidden, that dichotomy is a huge thing, you know, in Islamic thought, for instance, and, you know, in other systems of thought. Of course, like, there was, like, a wave of spiritualism, of, interest in the occult in the 19th century that has had a huge influence, you know, that we're a lot closer to. And so sometimes, like, it can be hard to sort of, you know, it's rigorous historical work to get back to, like, the ideas as they were in these, you know, what you could call esoteric or occult traditions, without, you know, having them be mediated by these kind of 19th century thinkers who often might have certain very wacky or misguided ideas. So, yeah, but I would say, you know, to answer your question in short, I would say that the occult as a theme is something that is relatively, at the risk of generalizing, is relatively transcultural, but the occult tradition has been heavily mediated by the sort of clique of people that were deeply interested in this in the Western world in the 19th century for us and our ideas about it. And this goes into, you know, the way that people see the occult and esotericism as being kind of like silly or wacky or dumb, because of like those people themselves, you know, being ridiculed at the time for legitimate and illegitimate reasons, and also their association with sort of theatrical or, you know, absurd activities like seances, that type of thing, or stage magic or illusionism. But again, even as I say that association with the occult and actually sort of action through ritual practice, or transformation of the external world through ritual practice, has also always been associated with theatricality and illusionism. So, you know, that's kind of a hedge in terms of what I just said, but
yeah, like you said, it's complicated, right?
Yes.
Just getting back to the idea of it being them being kind of ridiculed for legitimate and illegitimate reasons. I've been reading this book off and on called Against the Modern World by Mark Sedgwick, and it's a history of capital T traditionalism. It talks about like theosophy and Madame Blavatsky, who kind of was like, I guess you could say like the founder of it, or one of the kind of premier originators. Guénon, all this kind of stuff traces it up to the present day, which I haven't got that far into it. I'm mainly in the kind of the origin story right now, but there's some really funny stories in here. Blavatsky seems pretty much like a clear fraud. Like she did these things where she would have like a seance, and she's always very interested in like attracting kind of like the upper crust to her meetings and stuff like that. She was trying to hawk a couple books. I forgot the name of them, but they had some goofy name like Visions of Isis or something.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about, although I also don't remember the exact. Yeah, that was a big thing. And you can even talk about that in terms of other philosophers like Nietzsche, you know, Greco-Roman revival, like bringing back the Eleusinian mysteries, like that type of thing she was very much into. But yeah, sorry, I'll continue.
Yeah, no problem. So like one of the things that was talking about was how she would like do a seance, and like the seance is supposed to conjure up some kind of spirit that they would communicate with, and the spirit would like drop a letter on the table in front of them, like literally like a piece of paper would fall to the table. And this was because when everyone was like closing their eyes and like kind of like getting into the mood or whatever, she would have this like bamboo pole that she would raise above the table with the letter on it and like drop it from that, and it would like float down to the table, and then she would be like, oh look, the letter's been delivered, you know. So you know, there's a lot of weird stuff where it's like you can't tell how sincere someone like that is, because she's clearly going through an effort to create this artifice, and she, you know, obviously is like self-consciously acknowledging that the letter is not coming from some spirit, she's doing it herself. But you know, at the same time, like, why go through all this mess and effort to create this thing if you know, like, she wasn't like super wealthy or successful off of it? I don't think so. It's kind of weird.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't necessarily like have a psychoanalytic take on Blavatsky, but yeah, I think she definitely is like a bit of like a grifter and a fraud, and she was heavily criticized by even, you know, other traditionalists like Guénon was definitely like my favorite of that group of people. And yeah, it's easy to ridicule a lot of these people. But one thing that I will say, like, for them, you know, Blavatsky in particular, she's definitely the most famous, and like she's also the most easy to kind of lambast. But one thing I will say for like the group in general is that they were in a way at the vanguard of sort of the critique of like the Western sort of epistemology. You know, the idea of like sort of like before Derrida, before critical theory and all that stuff, sort of questioning, you know, the hegemony of science and rationalism and that type of stuff that, you know, we're now all familiar with. Like if we have any kind of like, you know, if we've been to undergrad recently, or, you know, in an academic environment in, you know, recent memory, that kind of originates with these people who are willing to take the premises of, you know, which they often misinterpreted, but they were willing to take the premises of sort of traditional epistemologies, or, you know, epistemologies from other cultures, alternative epistemologies, seriously. So that is something that can be said to their credit.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's something kind of interesting in the way that it's always calling back to some kind of past that needs to be revived. that's where like the real truth is, and that they live in like a time of decline and confusion and stuff like that. There always seems to be like this emphasis on Western civilization and modern civilization in decline, and that, you know, that's a common trope among right-wing thought in general, I think, and there's a lot of sort of overlap there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's this, overarching sort of connection between someone like Guénon and people make this connection a lot with far-right thought, and, almost like a tradition, where nowadays people point to people like Dugin or something like Duginism, and it's like almost like a rationalizing a cynicism or something like that too, where it's like kind of gets like a mystic veneer for something that's quite cynical. And obviously you saw that in things like the Nazi participation in some of these sort of ideological debates, like the strange quests and things that they went on and all that related to this. And I was wondering if you think that's something that's like inherent in that. I mean, if you're saying that something that is, connecting it to almost like a postmodernism or something, I would hope that, I mean, my view would be that's not inherently right wing, but I mean, that is kind of a popular take too nowadays, even that there is this inherent connection between a postmodernism and reactionary thought or something, like especially say like the late Foucault or something. People point to that a lot as him, cozying up to reactionary thought, they think. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, and the thing is, like, one thing I always say, like, working as like an intellectual historian and like an historian of ideas, like intellectual history isn't pretty, and there aren't usually like very clear good guys and bad guys. They're all like intermixed with each other, and a lot of the time, like, they're compromised in some ways, and they, some of the things that they say like are valuable. It's very hard to like pick like a distinct team to root for. And a lot of like tendencies, of course, Mussolini, for instance, like being a socialist, like early on, like a lot of these ideas, like, that maybe people on the left would, consider to be like good, or want to have like a simplistic view of being unequivocally positive, like Marx's ideas. They're hugely influential on the right wing, of course, like they're hugely influential in general. And that's the case of many of these things. And like really, when it comes down to this idea of like, a glorious revival, like, and sort of a cyclical sense of history, like that really is in Marx. And the narrative of progress, like the critique of that, in a way, the right-wing thought that you're referring to kind of does hinge on this sort of flawed narrative of progress that I feel like traditionalists who wanted to talk about cyclical history, at least some of them, Guénon is one, but there's also obviously this idea of glorious revival. But anyway, I digress. My point is that the narrative of progress, that some of these far-right thinkers view, was something that these traditionalists in some cases did try to critique. And I think that now we're actually seeing, I think it's, this idea of history as being directed towards some sort of teleology of progress. I think we're definitely seeing that fall apart, and these ideas of crisis or Kali Yuga that some of these traditionalists would entertain, I think are much more difficult to dismiss compared to, sort of a Fukuyama type narrative. So, but yes, I think that it's a complicated issue, and you can't really extricate it, especially when you start looking back in history, like, whether something is usually these sort of broader intellectual trends, sort of the issue of history. Was it moving towards something? Is it like, a eternal recurrence of some kind? Those things, exist on both sides. You can see it in aesthetic movements. You can see it in philosophical movements. It's, I don't know if it's inherently, I guess maybe any intellectual trend that's significant will be seized upon by all sort of political actors, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, like, Evola is probably he's probably the one figure that is most obviously like a right-wing political figure. And he was actually critical of, like, fascist Italy and stuff. Like, it didn't go far enough for him in a certain sense. And it's not as easy to just say, oh, well, he was even more extreme than Mussolini or something like that. Because I think that he had a different sense about what sort of a new state or a new kind of politics or order should arise. And, I think you can clearly say, like, it probably wouldn't have been very good. It was definitely on the right-wing side of things and all that. But it's still taking aim at like modernity and seeing that like even fascist Italy was taking up like certain aspects of modernity that he was, you know, fundamentally critical of and stuff like that. So it's just interesting because they don't neatly fit into the kind of like left right thing exactly, you know.
Yeah, I think that few people do, and like the sort of political paradigm that we operate by now has changed even like so much even since that time. I mean, Evola had a lot of like, you know, wacky ideas, like, you know, or like repugnant ideas, like, you know, his racialist views, and those were ideas that were repudiated by some traditionalists, although they were embraced by some others and like encouraged in other ways. You know, Blavatsky also definitely flirted with like a kind of Aryanism, but you know, notions of like physiognomy, racialist ideas, like they also exist like on the political left and have like historically. I mean, like Marx is the one that keeps coming to mind as someone who, you know, to go back to this kind of idea of seances and that like you know, the sort of vogue for seances in the 19th century, you can see that, you know, being referenced in Capital, you know, the idea of commodity fetishism. Really, like the whole idea of commodity fetishism is like a sort of parody or a joke at the expense of, you know, certain cultures and certain like cultural ways of knowing. And, you know, it's sort of also inflected by sort of spiritual ideas that were going on at the time. But to really say that, you know, Marx says at one point in Capital, not to delve too deeply into him, but he says at one point in Capital, you know, we need to step outside, you know, or we need to step into the misty fog of like religious thought to make sense of this. We need to make analogy to the hazy mists of the religious world with its, you know, but of course he's deeply embedded in that world. And, you know, he imagines himself as being outside of it, as a lot of these writers often do, you know, having a view from nowhere. But really, a lot of his ideas are, you know, defined, as he even says himself, like through reference to this, through this idea of kind of a hidden spirit. This is how he understands capitalism. This is how he critiques it, is these commodities have some kind of hidden spirit to them. And so these notions are traveling, you know, very incestuously, you know, very promiscuously through all these intellectual circles and touching all kinds of political tendencies.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, since we're talking about Marx, I guess even like the Nazis in Germany, they have roots in similar sorts of groups. Like I was listening to something that was talking about synarchy and how this has there's a lot of connections between synarchy and these types of traditionalist, esoteric kind of groups. And the Thule Society, I think that's how you pronounce it, started as one of these types of things. And interestingly enough, it got its start in Istanbul. This German guy went to Istanbul and founded the group there. And that seemed to be the case for a lot of these groups, actually. And came back to Germany, kind of made a branch of that group, and that eventually became like the German something party, which then evolved into the National Socialist Party. So it like has direct roots to these kinds of groups. So yeah, it's just interesting. You know, it's something that we don't really learn much about. I don't think we typically have a good way of understanding where they fit into history, you know, because certainly they're influential when you kind of dig into it. You can kind of see that they're like all over the place. These ideas are floating around all over the place. But, you know, you don't hear people talk about them openly. You know, they were, you know, I mean, it's funny because they're esoteric groups and they're all about like hidden knowledge, and they've sort of become that themselves, you know?
No, I was just about to say that's the great irony, right? Like that, you know, this, the occult has such an influence, but because of somehow through like the negative associations that, you know, it's really in many ways always had, but also certain ones that it's acquired, you know, it's sort of people don't have access to that knowledge. Like their diagnosis has become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that people are cut off from, you know, the way that symbols interact and have a really important impact in our world. I mean, you were mentioning the Nazis, like one figure who I think has had a huge influence, who's still, you know, really talked about with reverence by people on like all sides of the political aisle, but was like a very enthusiastic National Socialist, is Heidegger, whose ideas, you know, are very, even though, you know, people think of them as think of phenomenology of being sort of very scientific, you know, very, you know, rooted in experience, you know, rejecting, as Heidegger kind of positions himself, but it's also very mystical. And it's based on, you know, kind of a ontological revolution, and thought happening, all these same sort of tropes coming back. And his thought, he's probably the most influential philosopher in like the American Academy, I would say. And, he was a super big Nazi. And, also he was very much steeped in that tradition of, he had read like Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy, that like he was influenced by all these thinkers, he was a reader of them, and he was, immersed in that culture. So, the impact, it definitely remains. But yeah, it is occulted in a way.
I was also thinking that, there's this, I mean, almost like in a crude way, there's this tendency on, lots of different types of radical movements to then, like on the left, to use a lot of this language of, the fetishism and also, related things around ideology to then set themselves up almost as using symbols in these kind of strange ways where, they'll say to themselves, we are the people who have this kind of almost hidden knowledge of, the way things are, and we have to kind of bring it to people. And, we kind of see through the false consciousness. And I mean, on like as a radical activist, I think there is, when people have that worldview, sometimes it can kind of create this strange, it's cliche to call it religious, but it is, it does have that kind of sense to it where you're operating in the world as someone that has special knowledge about what the future is going to be like. And you're operating almost as an independent agent, just imposing that view on people who are somehow, either asleep or just sort of, shambling through life. And you can kind of bring that to it. So I think that was it's interesting to talk about the fetishism part because, those kind of, that style of thinking at least has huge effects on politics later on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it like the people who I feel like you're talking about would probably say that, Derrida was, sort of a counter revolutionary or something for having like, certain critiques of the Soviet Union or being compromised in other ways. But what I will say for him is that he did point out, in his Spectres of Marx in 1993, that like Marx is obsessed with ghosts. Like his work is suffused with ghosts and the supernatural. Like all of his like key metaphors, like the way that he explains his concepts are in these terms. And so it's inextricable from these ideas. Like, yes, the notion of false consciousness, as you say, I think it's right that this is kind of an idea of having a sort of hidden insight, a transcendent kind of view of these things, to kind of to exercise like these sort of ghosts in a way. And I think that was really spot on diagnosis or spot on appraisal of Marx, and a very insightful thing. And, it's hard to say like whether others notice. I mean, that's the most prominent sort of discussion of it. But I think that it really does scream out of Marx these, spiritual ideas, even, the idea, like his discussion of like sort of the blood libel that kind of creeps into some of his work, and his discussion of Jews and that type of thing, and the way that he treats Christianity a lot of the time. He is a person of the 19th century, and yeah, his thoughts are very, very haunted. And people who, take that as doctrine, they are, they're following a doctrine that is also haunted.
So to what extent can we take this kind of thing seriously? Because I mean, do we want to like look at these sorts of ideas and where we find like an influence of this kind of occult kind? Do we want to like reject it just out of hand? Like this is some kind of like fundamental mistake to be thinking in this kind of way? Because I think that as we've been talking about, this is very much like something that we don't really speak about. We don't really, if you openly talk about things in these terms, you're inviting ridicule. Like no one's going to really take you seriously. But if we consider that this sort of thinking is really important and influential throughout history on left, right, and everywhere, what do we do with that? Like, do we embrace it? Do we maintain some kind of critical distance, or is it like what's the approach here?
It's hard to say, because I think it might actually be like a you can't win situation, because my instinct is to say that, no, we need to talk openly about it. We need to like speak and take seriously like some of these prepositions. We need to take seriously, the idea of demonic influences. We need to get seriously the idea of Antichrist. But, are those things ever going to be taken seriously? Like, or is it part and parcel of them that they're not? Is it part and parcel of the way these things work that they cannot be taken seriously? And that any attempt to do so, will not win. So, yeah, my instinct is to say, like, we should talk about these things openly and take these ideas seriously, because they, have an effect. Like, these symbolic operations, like, do bear themselves out. But will that work, or are there sort of defense mechanisms built in? Like, there's sort of ridiculousness of it, the theatricality of it, sort of is in some way inherent to it, where it will prevent it from, and it will cause the sort of the eschatological or the sort of teleological pattern from playing itself, will just, make it play itself out. So, yeah, I don't really know what the solution is.
Yeah, I guess that gets into some of the question around the relationship between cultism and sort of broader types of religion kind of thing, or like, like religion in general or something, where, I think people have to, is there some sort of question there around whether people's everyday experience of religion, if they're religious, is, similar in some way to having some sort of knowledge of, the fantastical or the sacred and profane or something like that, like, is there something in that, or is it something that only a select few people can really sort of push kind of thing? Because I keep thinking of, I was reading some book about, or like heard quote about something about, in medieval history, European medieval history, about, say, like, the Eucharist in Christianity. And there was this person, saying that for part of European history, there was this problem where people didn't grasp the idea that the Eucharist would be something like the host, or, the bread being made into Christ kind of thing. For a lot of time, the sort of mystical or fantastical or supernatural, I guess, like, was such a part of their everyday experience that the fact that a specific limited thing was fantastical was a problem for them, because it was like, well, why isn't everything? Like, it was almost like this trying to divide the world into this, narrow thing was the problem. And then as sort of, in early modernity, and sort of as time kind of rolls on, there's this division where the problem becomes, why is anything enchanted or something kind of thing? Why is anything fantastical? Why would a piece of bread be fantastical or something like that? So there's kind of the shift that, this author says happens, where people shift from thinking, why is there a specific, why isn't there just a general awe kind of thing at creation, to why would you have an awe at all about any aspect of it? So I don't know if that, I'm just trying to get through this, this thing of, is this sort of mystical experience or something that is accessible to everyone in, yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I think there might be like some conflation in our talking about it, especially like when, you cross the like modernity, pre-modernity divide. I think that, if you really go deep into it, like a lot of the time there's usually like a ripple effect where like there's layers of like truth, for instance, like the really important idea in Islamic, in Sufism, or, in the kind of Akbarian tradition of thought, Wahdat al-Wujud, Ibn al-Arabi, his idea, that everything, all the multiplicity that we see around us is just a veil or a screen for unity. That was widely adopted, a very exciting idea to a lot of people. But of course, later on, people were like, well, our intellectual idea of Wahdat al-Wujud, that's just like a screen itself for the reality, and so on and so on. So I think that in from our point of view, and I think this was a point that the sort of traditionalists, intellectual tendency made, that, there's sort of, there's been a severance from the sort of a whole aspect of reality. Reality is kind of solidified or closed in on itself, and things have become ordinary in a way that they weren't before. And then, of course, even in pre-modernity, there was an idea that, the normal practice of religion isn't the really real, the hakikah of it, the really real is something more, and that varies in terms of like what it really is, like, or what the real truth of things are, and like it varies based on the sort of like sociological position or the social position or the sort of political aspects of things, or the different positionalities. But that's basically a consistent theme in the sort of pre-modern esotericism and occultism, that the religious practices or the sort of religious doctrines that people know. Like, I'm reminded, as you say that, of Hayy and Yaqdhan, which is like sort of a philosophical fable about like a dude who basically is kind of born. Well, it's actually they give two explanations of the story, but either he's abandoned on a deserted island, like as a baby, or he's just like magically, or not magically, I shouldn't say, kind of to make sure our terms are clear here, but sort of just like genetically appears, abiogenetically appears. And anyway, so he somehow is able, just by himself with no other people around, basically figure out like the truth of Islam. And eventually someone comes to him from a civilization who's also kind of, a world-weary like dervish or a Sufi type figure, or a philosopher, maybe would be more accurate. But anyway, so then he explains to him like the actual doctrine of Islam, like the external factors of it, like who Muhammad was, like all this stuff. And he's like, oh yeah, that pretty much matches up with everything that I arrived at on my own. But, I just got that from like raw empiricism. I know like the core of it. And so then he goes back with the friend that he made to society, and he's like, well, I do have some misgivings, they're saying like on the boat back, I do have some misgivings about all the stuff that you told me, like why is the Quran so concerned with, financial transactions, why is it all about, like this type of thing, why are there these sort of metaphors about heaven and hell, these are not what I've experienced through my sort of meditations, it's not like how I've seen like supernal reality as being, like they seem kind of figurative, like why did the prophet talk in this way? But then once he sees everyone and he interacts with them and he realizes like how venal and like how prone to corruption they are, then he's like, oh wow, like now I understand the insight of the prophet, now I understand why he said all these things, because their best hope for these people to not suffer is for them to just follow the guidelines as strictly as possible. And like, this wisdom is only for like me and my buddy and like, those of us who really get it, but the rest of them, like for their own sakes, like it's just too much for them. And yeah, that's like a very like common idea, that most people are like on the level of animals, and only like the elect are like, they only have the sort of dignity, only they have the dignity of like true spiritual enlightenment. And yeah, that's a very, very like ubiquitous idea in these types of things, which, I'm like not necessarily down with. I'm like, more of an egalitarian persuasion most of the time, although like sometimes one becomes frustrated with people, in the same way. But
sure,
yeah, like I think that is like sort of an aspect of it. And you could say that very like, intractable part of it, you could say is, something that maybe creates the attraction for like the right wing or something. So, yeah, I guess that's a very long, like, discursive answer to your question. But, yeah, there you go. Basically, there's layers.
Yeah. So, I mean, just on that sort of idea, is there in Islam an idea of like a degradation of the message of the prophet over time? Like that I think Tom had mentioned something like this before, where I know that the Quran itself is considered like preserved, but do people sort of, is there a fading over time of the religion from its sort of, basic truths? Do people sort of fade away from it within the sort of history or the teleology or whatever, like the overarching thing of the religion? I know there was also before the Quran, like there's the sense that things had degraded and had to be kind of renewed or whatever, like clarified. And so, I mean, if that's the case, I mean, that would sort of play into the sort of traditionalist epistemology or something like that. So
yeah,
sure.
Well, there's like many answers.
Okay.
On one hand, like on one hand, definitely like everyone in history is always complaining about like everyone having fallen away from their religion or like the good way that things were done in the past. It's like a ubiquitous thing, I feel like, in history. And in terms of Islam, there's always this, lots of different figures, such as Ibn al-Arabi himself, who I mentioned, being sort of a seal, or, al-Ghazali as being like sort of the reviver of Islam, the revival of the religious sciences, that type of thing. So there's always like this very ubiquitous idea that things have fallen away. And another thing, which is kind of more what's going on in the Hayy bin Yaqdhan story, is that there's many various interpretations of like the Quran, and people who have a claim to esoteric knowledge can interpret these like in all different various ways, depending on how like intense they are. Like they could say, like they could just look at the individual letters and like decode some sort of alternate meaning there, or they could say like for instance in that story, the idea that these heaven and hell things, that's just figurative, but they're necessary to like keep people on the straight and narrow, that type of thing. That's like a philosopher idea, not necessarily endorsed by the Orthodox Sufis, who definitely would believe in these realities in various different ways. But yeah, so there's definitely like in terms of the sort of degradation of the message, like there's an idea of like failures of interpretation, both of the Quran itself, the prophetic traditions, and also like of various influential figures. People will say like, they're misunderstanding the statements of the people in our Tarika, which are often like very sort of arcane a lot of the time and open to various interpretations by design. And in addition to that, there's the idea that people have kind of just in general kind of become lax and fallen from like their religious duties. So yeah, there's many layers, I would say there in Islamic history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add to that there are like actual hadiths that pretty clearly indicate some sense of this, where there's an understanding that the people who have the most correct, like the most reliable interpretation of the religion as a whole are the people closest to the time of the Prophet. So the Prophet and his companions, and then the generation after and the generation after. And this is where the whole concept of like Salafism comes from, is like, well, it's been 1400 years, 1500 years, and now we're in this really awful post-colonial situation. We've fallen from grace as a civilization. I think what we need to do is go right back to the source, wipe out all that in between, and just follow the religion exactly as best we can as the companions, the earliest people, did. And that idea in itself is not something that they just made up. That does come from the tradition. It's just that they interpreted it in a much more, I would say like in a new way, where it means like all of the history in between the time of the Prophet and today are, incorrect, or like not really worth as much as just following what our understanding of what the companions understood was.
Yeah, in a way it was an anti-traditional move, because the premise of the whole tradition previously had been that it all was a chain going back to like the Salaf, the companions, Abu Bakr, Ali, and that it was, a verifiable, like trusted, legitimate chain going back to them. But Salafis a lot of the time say otherwise, that there are sort of deviations and innovations that were originated. I feel like I also should, just to be fair, mention that, like Shia, like obviously often have like, different interpretations of certain things in the Quran, or see proofs for, Ali's sort of, favored status in certain ayah that Sunnis don't necessarily see. So there's like definitely one example of differing interpretations. And there have actually been, like Gulat groups, like which are sort of extremist, or, literally like exaggerator Shias, which was a term that was applied to them by other Shias because they felt that they were exaggerating Ali's virtues. But groups like that would say things like 1/10 of the Quran was fabricated or lost or something, or that, even one of my favorite, which I'll never forget, is there was a group that was called like the Ghurayba, or like the Ravens, and they basically believed that Muhammad and Ali were so similar, they were like two ravens, and the angel Jibril actually got confused, and he brought the Quran to the wrong person when it had actually been intended for Ali. And so And those, people are really some of the ones who actually honestly originate some of the ideas of like the man of light, Lettrism, like they're at the forefront of some of those ideas that became later on a bit more orthodox, but of course there's many permutations of those ideas, but in fairness I felt I should mention them.
Sure. Yeah, I think some of those kind of splinter sects have very interesting little stories. Like I think I've heard about one where like a goat ate some of the Quran that's been lost or something. Yeah. It's just kind of amusing to think about.
Yeah, that's a favorite of Islamophobes. Yeah, I've heard that one trotted out on Twitter by like the anti-Islam brigade like a couple of times. Like a goat ate the Quran or something. Some pages of it, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, just to get back to some of the hadiths, I guess there's also like one that talks about how there will be like a righteous caliphate that will have a certain number of rulers. Different hadiths have different numbers, and then it will kind of revert to, or like the situation will revert to that of kings, and they will be like fairly good, and it just kind of will get worse and worse. Like there'll just be like a constant regression from the kind of like the zenith that is the reign of the righteous caliphs. And then there's also an idea that is present in a few different hadiths that I can think of that talk about religious knowledge being lost over time, to the extent that at the end of time people will know nothing except the name of God. They'll just kind of say Allah, and that's all they'll know of religion anymore. And this comes all up to the point of like Mahdi and Jesus coming back and all that. So like then the whole big show starts. But like up until that point, yeah, there is an idea of things kind of being in perpetual decline up to that point. I'm not sure, like that clearly is present in the Western intellectual tradition. I don't know how much of that is part of like the Christian tradition specifically. Do you know, Don?
I'm not exactly sure about decline as like a long-term process. I know obviously it like at the very end it's supposed to be that there's two related things. There's one problem, which is existing worldly society good at any given point, and that's usually not good. Like it's usually like, I mean, the answer is usually negative kind of thing. Like it's that. So anytime that you're like looking around, you would see signs that things are pretty bad and whatever. But you're not supposed to. There is this tradition also that you're not really supposed to speculate. I mean, in the Catholic tradition. I mean, within the obviously a lot of fundamentalists or different evangelicals in the United States, or other. I mean, and within even the Catholic faith, there's always been this focus on the end times, whatever, as a major, sometimes people do think it's imminent and stuff, but within the actual ideological, I mean, like the, theological tradition, you're not really supposed to speculate on that. You're supposed to live as if you are, in kind of that dual way of live as if you could die any time, but also live not expecting to see the end times in your, in your immediate experience. So then within the actual end time sort of narrative within Revelation, it does have, the idea that, large sections of the population are not religious anymore or whatever, or somehow not religious, but somehow, fallen in some way or whatever. And, that people will be fooled very easily by, all these terrible things happening, like all these wars and all this kind of stuff. But it is pretty much, it's different in the way that it's much more, it's much more very directly like the narrative is much more mystical and kind of an explicit kind of strange way or something like that. It's not really like not much of the rest of the Bible actually talks about this kind of stuff in the same way kind of thing. It just like there's this very specific kind of narrative, but in the rest of it, it's more kind of focusing on the issue of redemption and all these kind of things, right? So, I mean, but I think that the problem that is more, how do you interact with a world that is clearly fallen in some way, like has lots of different problems and challenges and risks and stuff for you as a believer kind of thing. And so I think anyway, so that's the whole the three pieces of it, of that kind of sort of teleology. I mean, like eschatology. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's similar stuff in Islam as well. There's always an emphasis that no one knows the hour, that type of thing. But at the same, and yet, it's the same where people are very much interested in speculating or convinced that they are, living in the end times. Actually, to relate it back to the hadith, one of my favorite ones is that the Prophet kind of held two fingers, apart and said, we're this close to the last day. And I love that hadith because, like, if you think about it, a lot of people, like, at first when you hear it, you're like, oh, well, that was a failed prophecy, because obviously here we are in the year 2020 and there's no apocalypse. But on the other hand, if you think about that in the whole scheme of history, in the whole age of the earth, in a way, it may very well bear itself out to be correct. Yeah, I myself, always do feel like, this is it, like, we're headed towards disaster. And I almost feel like that is a more appealing or, a narrative that rings truer than one of, progress towards, like, some great destiny or something that is just a sort of crisis unfurling across the ages to this, great, cataclysm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel kind of similarly, and it makes me relate to the stuff we were talking about earlier on. I don't know, like, some of their ideas I feel pretty inclined to agree with, at least the general thrust of the argument, like the ideas in particular about, like, the criticisms of modernity and the way that people now interpret the world and that kind of stuff. I don't follow all of them all the way down the line, but they're onto something, I think. And I think that there's religion, like, that isn't part of these sorts of, if we want to even think of these esoteric groups as religious, but I think religion offers you a way to deal with the fact that the world isn't great. It's never probably ever going to be super great, and that we aren't necessarily on some kind of, like, just constant upward trend of progress and everything getting better all the time. That lets you, like, function. It tells you, like, how to deal with that fact and to focus on things that kind of transcend that. And I think that's that's the way to do it. You don't want to get too fixated on the idea of, like, oh, things are in decline, or also be put on, like, rosy glasses and just sort of look at things like it's always just going to get better and ignore the problems in the world, because that's also going to, at some point, you're going to run into the brick wall of reality, and that's not going to be great. So, yeah, I don't know. There's something to that, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, it's a way to kind of make sense of some of these, events, and I think to deal with them in, like, an appropriate way. And yeah, I think that a lot of the, like, pain that is caused is kind of from the flailing that sort of results from the aversion to some of, like, the ideas that would be, like, considered within the category of religion or metaphysics, and sort of the resistance to them, I think, does kind of result in a lot of pain. But I think that, again, yeah, to go back to sort of earlier parts of the discussion, it's in a way an inevitable kind of, like, self-fulfilling thing, because that's what these traditions have always expected. That's what they're kind of, their 19th century mediators also expected, in that great time of upheaval, the 19th century, where just everything was being shattered by, like, things to do with evolution, industrialization, like, all this stuff. A lot of them were very prescient and kind of seeing the way that things would go, even if they were kind of an apocalyptic mentality. And yeah, I think that, it is, it's valuable.
Yeah, for sure. I think the idea of, like, flailing is a really good way to put it, because you can flail in a way that's like, oh, we got to keep everything together, or flail in a way that's like, oh, everything's great, we should just keep doing more of this. And I think that the answer is really just, like, just do your thing, like, maintain whatever duties you have, your obligations that you have, keep that up, just keep doing the right thing. Know that you're not necessarily part of some grand project that will revive the the world, or that is pushing things onward and upwards. Just kind of do your thing and live your life, and then that's all you can really do.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me think more about just, yeah, I don't know, just the worldview of a religious person, as the reality of the symbols and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I don't have much to add, but just it's helping me along. So yeah.
Cool. Okay then. So yeah, let's get into some questions here. Okay, this first one. In his new song, rapper Blueface incorrectly postulates that if you're scared, you should pray to the Pope. My question is, when will Don step up to do Catholic outreach to the hip-hop community by teaching them the catechism and Catholic teachings? He could fulfill a Catholic role like Louis Farrakhan has done for Islam. I hope I pronounced that right. Catechism?
Catechism.
Catechism? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was thinking of maybe joining KRS-One at the Temple of Hip Hop, and we could teach together. I don't know. I've actually thought about doing that kind of stuff in the future. That kind of teaching and stuff. I think that'd be cool, like the small groups and stuff. I'd have to see though. I don't know. I feel like, yeah, I don't know. I think it'd be fun.
Like the hip hop community specifically?
No. Not the hip hop community specifically, but just like, learning more about theology and how and then being able to teach it in turn kind of thing. So, yeah.
Sure. All right. Next question here is, why are people terrible?
What do you think?
Well, I don't think people are terrible, really. I mean, I think people do terrible things. I think some people are terrible. I think overall, I wouldn't judge most people as being terrible. So, depends how you want to take this question. Is it like, why do people do terrible things, or why are some people just so terrible?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, not like to weigh in myself. I don't know, but yeah, I would like. I feel like maybe people. Yeah, I would say people are terrible, but I mean, in general, like people as like humanity, it's terrible. But there's also wonderful aspects of it. Maybe like people are terrible to bring the wonderful aspects into relief. Could be, that's a stab at an explanation.
Yeah. I feel like maybe in a crude way, like people are like 80% pretty good and then 20% crazy. And then that what ends up happening is that you only notice that 20% when it kind of affects you usually. But like just I don't know. I always feel like I'm in a Fellini movie or something, just like surrounded by people who are exaggerated, weird characters getting too close and stuff, and I just I don't like it. So I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely know what you mean. I definitely know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, whenever I think about stuff like this, I kind of, for some reason, I always think of like driving and like the highway and how there's these people like just driving these 2-ton like hunks of metal at like 90 miles an hour, and there's just so few accidents when you consider what's actually happening, and it's all just dictated by the fact that there's like these little paint marks on the road, and that just is pretty amazing to me. And I think that kind of like that's sort of like a metaphor. You can elaborate that out to like all of society and stuff. So like considering what we have to work with, I don't think we're doing too bad, but we're not perfect, and that's just gonna be something that you're gonna notice, and just kind of gotta live with it. I'm reminded of this kind of longish quote from Ali, like Imam Ali, and the first part of the quote talks about, he's responding to someone who's cursing the world, and he says like, well, when did the world ever deceive you? Like, it's pretty apparent that the world is bad. Like your mother got sick and you prayed and she still died, and just things are bad all over. And I always like that part, but the second part is actually kind of ringing a little bit more in my ear right now, where he talks about like this world was made as a place for you to like do good deeds. It's like a field for you to sow crops, like to kind of like invest in, and it's a place for you to exert yourself, and it's not necessarily like a good place, right? Like it's more like a place for you to work, and then you'll benefit from that later. So yeah, that's why people are terrible, and that's why things are terrible. And I think the reason things are terrible is often because of the terrible stuff that people do. If we were not here, I imagine things would be a lot more pleasant. But that's just not how it is. It is the way it is for a reason. Okay, next question here. Are there some things that are better left unsaid? Yes.
Sure.
Next question. When I'm having a bad night and spiraling into depression, nothing comforts me like hearing Dawn's voice.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, no question there. Just a nice comment. Yeah. Okay, what are your thoughts on schools reopening in the United States? All right, so this is a little bit of a Corona-related question, but I can do this one.
As a foreigner, I would say that, and maybe related to Canada, I don't know. I guess, I kind of think of it in two ways. I kind of have to remind myself that, like, students have goals. So, like, they, or like parents have goals for the students kind of thing, like where they kind of have to, like, say they want to become a doctor, they have to learn this kind of stuff now so that they can, they might be taking high school biology so that they can apply to medical school or something like that. So it's very time, they don't want to lose a few years of their life early on and do that. But for me, I'm like, maybe because I used to read a lot of Maoist stuff, I'm like, just shut down the schools for a few years or something. I don't know. I don't see the, might as well just do that. Might as well. All the, like, strange, like, I feel so sorry for a lot of the teachers and stuff that have to do, like distance education, but like flex kind of thing. Like you're teaching, like I heard one of the options that was being promoted was that a small group of students could come and then the rest would be doing it by video link. And that's just like a nightmare to me. I can't imagine wanting to teach that or something. So, and I don't know. I feel like it's not like, I don't know. Like it's just, and I guess people have been kind of making this comment too, that it's like warehousing students kind of thing. They're just, it's so that the parents can work and stuff. But I don't know. I feel like this is it's hit us just, it's just blindsided us, the whole crisis, in a way that the trying to retain a sense of normalcy in these kind of half-assed ways always seems like it's just backfiring. So, yeah.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind for me is like, I think if everyone had like equal access to things like the internet and like an appropriate like learning environment at home and all that kind of stuff, that e-learning would be like a good response until they've really sorted this situation out. But that's just not the case. And I don't think that they are going to try to amend that anytime soon. So I honestly do not know what the right move is. My first instinct is, just keep it closed, right? But there's so many issues that come up because of that, and yeah, it's just it's a really difficult situation. I don't know how much the whole like loss of time in terms of like the students' education is. I feel like that is, it's a thing, but I don't know, something about that just seems like, well, everyone's going to be kind of on the same playing field as far as this goes. And I don't know. I feel like people can catch up to where they need to be, assuming that this kind of blows over in a couple years at least or something.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of depends on the school. Like in terms of like high school and anything below that, I feel like that's mostly like an institution that exists like for socialization for the most part.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I don't think you're missing too much in terms of education that you couldn't get at home if you made the effort. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if and I don't think that even if you didn't make the effort, you'd be missing like that much, versus like what you would just encounter like in your day-to-day life. At like higher levels, like, yeah, maybe it's a little bit more of like an issue, but I think that at those levels, like, there's a lot more a wider range of options in terms of what you can do, like in terms of like opening libraries, or I think e-learning is like more viable in some ways at like the higher education level. But yeah, like you said, not really qualified to like expound on this, and yeah, it's a huge issue.
Right. I felt like, at least for me at college, I felt like a lot of the stuff that I was doing was on my own. Like I was, you do huge amounts of reading and you are writing papers and stuff, and then you just like meet with a professor once or twice a week, and you kind of, it's like a check-in thing, and you present your writing, or you talk about the stuff you've been reading or whatever. I don't know if that is really like impacted by an e-learning situation that much. Like, clearly it's always better to do this in person, but given the circumstances, I don't think that's a bad substitute. But that being said, I might consider, if I was in college right now, I would consider just dropping out and going back later,
Yeah.
Yeah. I personally wouldn't be able to handle it. I just wouldn't be able to, like, just with everything else going on too, not just like, not just the actual workload and stuff, but also like, just turning on the news and not, it not being good. I don't know. So like, yeah.
Does that stuff really bother you guys? I see people talking about that, like, oh man, it's just weighing on me, and I don't know. Maybe I'm like, it just doesn't bother me that much. I feel like the news is always like that to some extent. Like, clearly this is worse, it's different, etc. But I don't know.
I think there's a certain psychic toll. Yeah, it's not like at the forefront of my mind where it's like, but, I do think, like, to be honest, there is a certain psychic toll to the uncertainty of the future. Like, we really don't know, like, how things are going to develop from here. And, like, that, just having that sort of lurking in the back of your mind, like, the kind of worry about the future, I think is kind of a stressful thing that kind of adds up. But I mean, I also do like see your point where, there's a little bit of melodrama in like some, cases of when this is expressed. But I definitely understand the psychic toll that it can take as well.
I'm not accusing anybody of like melodrama. I'm not saying that, like, I think it's me that's the weird one here. I see enough people and it seems like a perfectly reasonable response, but I just don't experience that. And I wonder if that's because I feel weirdly hopeful because it's so uncertain. And I think the certainty that we had before was really dreadful. Like, just to know that things were going to continue on in this way seemed pretty dire and bad. Like, it was just heading towards a climate apocalypse and just like, this kind of thing. And now that it's like, oh man, the elites don't know what to do. Well, good. Maybe they'll have to figure out like that they got to do the right thing now, or it's all over. I don't know.
That's hopeful. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't had any such thoughts. I've only thought like, oh man, things are, getting worse. Like, as we were saying earlier, like, there's ways to deal with that, or to kind of like, take it in stride when things start to, deteriorate. But yeah, I think that in some ways I have, like, because I'm sort of a solitary person, like, just like what I do, like, reading and writing, like, it's, a solitary thing. So yeah, I think it hasn't had the same toll on me that it may have had on others. So I think in that respect, yeah, like, I also have that eccentricity where I haven't been as impacted as others. But in terms of like seeing this as, as a hopeful moment, like I haven't really, I just feel like, especially here in the United States where it's just been so botched, I'm just like, this is gonna, I try to hold out hope that each sort of escalation or, the opposite is like, it's gonna somehow stop the slide there. But for the most part, I've been like, I don't know if this will, I don't know. Yeah, I guess maybe I'm a pessimist in that way because I don't see like the behavior of the elites changing or the people being able to sort of wrest control from them. As a result of this, my instinct is, and I may be wrong, but my instinct is that things are going to get more dire as a result. But not to be a downer, but yeah.
No, I think that makes sense. It's sort of like we all got kidnapped and we're in the back of a van, we're all tied up and tape over our mouths and stuff, and they're trying to drive us off somewhere, and we're like, oh Jesus, what's going to happen? But then something happens, like they got a flat tire and they crashed or whatever, and now they're in a bad situation too, and it's like, well, maybe this is our chance, but it could also just get a lot worse.
Yeah. That made me kind of think through what I was feeling about that. It was that I guess, to almost contradict myself anyways, but like I find like I think I would just find it annoying to be in school is the thing, the kind of thing. It's not like, like it's not like I was be depressed about what's going on really, but it's more like I can just imagine being in like a high stakes, high cost program or something and having to do like a full school load, like full course load, and just feeling like, not wanting to do 20 hours of video meetings a week or something and all that kind of stuff. I think I would
like,
just
what's
find
the point kind of a thing?
not even what's the point, but just kind of like just finding it like irritating or something. Like just kind of like, for me, that would be like why I wouldn't enroll in the first place and why I'd be fine with the school shutting down completely, except for like maybe research students and stuff like that. But on the other end of that, it also made me realize that I was like, yeah, but because I feel like it's low stakes, like I could see taking a course or two and just kind of doing that, chipping away at something, because that would be fine with me, because it's like, well, it's just some online thing and it's all like the world's crazy anyways. So I could just do that, and it would be like a little bit irritating, but I could learn some stuff and just do that. Like it feels like the stakes would be so low for me then that it wouldn't make me irritated or anxious or anything. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, like, when this all happened, like, even if for a split second, like, there's a thought, like, is my life in danger? Like, are my loved ones going to be in danger? Is, like, my livelihood in danger? Like, things like, there's a sense of, like, a real, like, kind of imminent threat that didn't exist before that kind of emerged with this pandemic. And I think that in certain situations where, like, you're talking about something like, I don't know, like, writing like for instance, in my situation, like writing about like the like early 16th century esotericism or like occult practices, you're like, man, is this like sometimes the kind of noonday demon can come to you, I think, and like kind of make like, what's the point of doing this, like when that's kind of in the background, like, or when, to go back to the idea of stakes, I think when people are like, oh, we really got to like finish this project, this is really, important for the field or whatever, like, it's like, well, like, are we all gonna die? Like, like, it's just like, but sure. I do think like, to go, like, maybe to go back on the idea of hope, I do think that is also like valuable in a way, to have like this kind of like reminder, to have a shake up and to think about like what really matters and one's priorities. So yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, we'll finish off with a few lighthearted ones here. What are your opinions on 8 Mile? So I personally think that it's a much better version of the rap musical that was popularized with Hamilton. But you can see a lot of sort of precedent that was established in 8 Mile that was like carried out in Hamilton in
Sure.
kind of more spectacular form.
Mm-hmm.
I really think stylistically, like, Hamilton most resembles Eminem of like any prominent rapper, and I say that like, and I say that as like an Eminem fan, like going like way back, and I will say Eminem like is interesting. He's like a nebulously kind of Islamic figure in a way, bagpipes
Really?
from Baghdad. He says Alhamdulillah and bagpipes from Baghdad. I remember looking that up on Rap Genius, and someone had written it as like hum-dee-dee-da or something. I'm like, no, he's saying alhamdulillah.
That's good.
But yeah, no, I like 8 Mile, pretty well. I agree with Tom's remark.
I never saw the actual movie, just because I like the whatever it's called, Yourself. What is it? I can't remember.
Lose Yourself?
Lose Yourself. Yeah, the song from it. But I never actually saw the actual movie because I felt like, I don't know, like I feel like I got everything I needed from the trailer, like I knew the entire story from it, kind of thing.
Yeah,
you know
pretty much.
I was like, that's just what's gonna happen, and I was like, I don't actually have to see it because I don't know. I just felt like it would be a chore to actually sit through it or whatever. So, but I do like the song though.
Yeah. All right. So this one here says Don Hughes is to Catholicism as Jan Hus is to Protestantism. So again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. All these exotic Christian things are difficult for me to pronounce. But that's the guy that founded Hussism, right? Or the Hussites?
I think that's I don't know much about this, but it's like I think he was like a Dutch reformer or something. I'm gonna Google to make sure that I he's like a Calvinist, early Calvinist or something. Okay, so he is from Czechia, like the Czech Republic, I guess. And
I think they called it Czechia now.
Yeah. Oh, they do call it Czechia?
I think they renamed it recently.
Oh, really? Jan Hus. Okay, so he was Czech. Oh, yeah, Hussitism, predecessor to Protestantism. No, I don't know anything about this.
All I know, I know that that's a thing because it's in a Civilization 6 mod that adds more religions, and that's one of the Christian ones that's always left over after everyone takes Catholicism and stuff.
Sure.
Which sort of sums it up, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I wonder what like the analogy to Don is, like what the principle of the comparison is.
I guess they're saying that I'm like a proto-reformer for the Catholic Church or something.
Oh.
I don't know. So, I don't know. I will say possibly, stay tuned. That's what I'll say.
We really need to get a Protestant on here to kind of explain what the heck's going on over there.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Would Tom support the building of a memorial to the victims of female illiteracy? Yes, I would. I'm kind of in a dilemma here. I've been thinking about this. So the idea that comes to mind is a statue of a woman with a book in her lap looking very perplexed and like she's, just can't tell what's going on in the book. And in the book, it just says freedom across the page. But the thing is, building statues is haram because it will lead to people, revering this person as some sort of deity eventually. So, yeah, it's a tricky situation. I'm not really sure what a good alternative would be.
Could you have like a conceptual statue? Like
I believe
some sort
so.
of...
It's the figurative nature of it because it
could just be like a bunch of gibberish, like what women see when they look at a page,
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll just put like some Korean letters up there or something.
Okay.
And here's a question. Could you two please remake the Chunky Load episode of No Goals? Also, if you have Sleepy Girl on as a guest, that would be nice. So this is maybe the second or third time that people have requested that Sleepy Girl comes on here. So, yeah, maybe we'll do that. What do you think, Don?
Yeah, we'll see. She's quite vulgar, but we can maybe have her on.
You will have to figure out like a bleep kind of thing, a little button.
Sure.
But yeah, that would be good.
Yep.
All right, so that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for coming on again, Khalid. That was a really interesting chat about esotericism and all that fun stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
We will probably be doing another episode pretty similar to this one about Rene Guénon specifically. We were planning on doing that with a second guest in addition to Khalid, but he couldn't make it, so we decided to do something that was a little bit more generalized, and then we'll do that specific episode later on. So stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like a second episode of You Can't Win every week, you can subscribe to our Patreon and you will get that, as well as access to our Discord where you can chat with us in our community. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.